My granddaughter looked me dead in the eye across that mahogany dinner table, the same table where I'd taught her to count pennies when she was 5, and said the words that would haunt me for months. "Grandpa, you don't belong in our generation. Maybe it's time you just stepped aside." The silence that followed was deafening. 23 family members, all frozen mid-bite, waiting to see if the old man would finally break. If you've ever felt the sting of being dismissed by someone you love, you know that moment when your heart stops beating and the world tilts sideways. That's exactly where I was sitting when my carefully constructed world began to crumble. Before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. If this story hits you the way it's hitting me right now, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what happened next, what I did to get my revenge, it's going to shake you to your core. And I need to know I'm not alone in this. My name is Robert Mitchell, but everyone calls me Bob. I'm 67 years old, and until that dinner, I thought I knew exactly who I was. I was the patriarch of the Mitchell family. The man who built Mitchell & Sons Construction from nothing. The grandfather who never missed a birthday, never forgot a school play, never said no when one of my kids needed help. I was the guy who still changed his own oil, who could fix anything with duct tape and determination, who believed that respect was earned through decades of showing up. But apparently, I was wrong about everything. The dinner was supposed to be a celebration. My youngest son David had just gotten promoted to partner at his law firm, and my daughter-in-law Rebecca thought it would be nice to have the whole family together. 3 generations around one table, my 2 sons, their wives, my 5 grandchildren ranging from 8 to 24. It should have been perfect. The conversation started innocently enough. We were talking about technology, about how fast things were changing. My grandson Tyler, David's oldest boy, was going on about some new app that could apparently read your mind or predict your future or some nonsense like that. I made a joke about how when I was his age, we were impressed if a calculator could do square roots. That's when Emma, Tyler's younger sister, decided to educate me about the modern world. Emma was 21, a junior at Northwestern studying communications with a minor in digital media. She had her mother's sharp features and her father's argumentative streak, but until that night, she'd always been sweet to me. Always asked about my stories from the old days, always seemed genuinely interested in hearing about how we built the business with nothing but sweat and stubbornness. But something had changed. Maybe it was college, maybe it was her friends, maybe it was just the arrogance that comes with being young and thinking you know everything. She started explaining to me why my generation was holding back progress, why we didn't understand climate change, why our values were outdated. She used words like problematic and literally every other sentence, and she spoke to me like I was a child who couldn't possibly understand the complexity of her enlightened worldview. I tried to stay calm. I really did. I explained that my generation had built the very foundations she was standing on, that we'd fought wars and built cities and raised families without instruction manuals or participation trophies. But the more I talked, the more condescending she became. And then she said it. Those words that cut deeper than any physical wound I'd ever suffered. "Grandpa, you don't belong in our generation. Maybe it's time you just stepped aside." The thing about betrayal is that it doesn't just hurt in the moment. It rewrites history. Suddenly, every memory you have with that person becomes suspect. Every smile, every hug, every "I love you, Grandpa," gets filtered through this new reality where you're just an obstacle to be moved aside. I looked around that table, searching for an ally, someone who would defend me. My sons both stared at their plates. My daughters-in-law found their wine glasses fascinating. The other grandchildren suddenly became very interested in their phones. The only person who looked directly at me was my 8-year-old granddaughter Lucy, and even she seemed confused by the tension crackling through the air. Here's what really got to me: Emma wasn't wrong about everything. My generation did make mistakes. We did leave some messes for them to clean up. But what she didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that we also left them opportunities, foundations, and freedoms that we never had. We gave them the luxury of criticizing us because we'd already done the hard work of building something worth criticizing. But in that moment, sitting at my own dinner table, surrounded by the family I'd spent my entire life providing for, I felt like a relic. A broken-down old man who'd outlived his usefulness. And the worst part was the silence from everyone else. Their silence said everything. They agreed with her, they just didn't have the courage to say it out loud. I excused myself from the table. Told them I wasn't feeling well, which wasn't entirely a lie. I walked upstairs to my bedroom, the bedroom I'd shared with my wife Margaret for 38 years before cancer took her 2 years ago, and I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her picture on the nightstand. Margaret would have known what to do. She would have handled Emma with grace and wisdom, probably would have found a way to turn the whole thing into a teaching moment. But Margaret wasn't there, and I was just a tired old man who'd apparently outlived his welcome in his own family. That's when I heard them downstairs. They thought I couldn't hear, but the old house carries sound, and they weren't exactly whispering. Emma was holding court, explaining to everyone how difficult it was to deal with older relatives who couldn't adapt to change. She used phrases like cognitive rigidity and generational trauma, like she was diagnosing me from her sophomore psychology textbook. But it was what my son David said that really broke my heart. My baby boy, the one I'd carried on my shoulders to every Cubs game, the one I'd taught to drive in this very driveway, the one whose law school tuition I'd paid without him even asking. He said, "Maybe Emma has a point. Dad's been struggling since Mom died. Maybe it would be better for everyone if we started making some of the bigger family decisions without him." That was the moment I realized I wasn't just dealing with one disrespectful granddaughter. I was dealing with a family that had collectively decided I was no longer relevant. They weren't just dismissing my opinions, they were planning to sideline me entirely. I stayed upstairs for the rest of the evening, listening to them laugh and carry on like nothing had happened. Like they hadn't just driven a knife through the heart of a man who'd given them everything. When the last car pulled out of the driveway around 10 o'clock, I came downstairs to find the dishes still on the table, the leftover food still sitting out, and a house that felt more empty than it had since Margaret's funeral. But here's the thing about rock bottom. It gives you a solid foundation to build on. And as I stood in that kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of the worst dinner of my life, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to just step aside. I wasn't going to fade quietly into irrelevance. If my family thought I was just a harmless old man who didn't belong in their generation, they were about to learn just how wrong they could be. Because you don't build a successful construction business for 40 years without learning a thing or two about patience, planning, and the satisfaction of watching something come together exactly the way you designed it. And my granddaughter Emma was about to become the beneficiary of everything I'd learned about careful, methodical, devastating construction. She wanted me to step aside? Fine. But first, I was going to teach all of them, exactly what happens when you underestimate someone who's had 67 years to learn how the world really works. The first thing I did was nothing. For 2 weeks, I let them think they'd won. I stopped calling, stopped dropping by unannounced, stopped offering unsolicited advice about everything from car maintenance to career choices. I played the part of the wounded grandfather who'd gotten the message and retreated to lick his wounds. But while they were congratulating themselves on finally putting the old man in his place, I was doing something I'd perfected over 4 decades of business. I was gathering intelligence. See, Emma thought she was so smart with her college education and her social media expertise, but she'd made a crucial mistake. She'd forgotten that her grandfather wasn't just some random old guy. I was Robert Mitchell, the man who negotiated million-dollar contracts with developers who could eat her for breakfast. I didn't survive in the construction business by being nice. I survived by being smarter, more patient, and more ruthless than everyone who underestimated me. The first thing I learned was that Emma's confident facade was hiding some significant cracks. A few discreet conversations with family friends revealed that my golden granddaughter wasn't quite as successful as she pretended to be. Her grades at Northwestern were mediocre at best. She'd already changed her major twice and was on academic probation. The communications degree she was so proud of? She was barely maintaining a 2.3 GPA. But the real revelation came when I had lunch with Harold Peterson, an old friend whose grandson went to Northwestern. Harold mentioned in passing that Emma had been bragging on social media about her family connections, and how her grandfather's construction company was going to set her up with an internship at a major development firm after graduation. That stopped me cold. Not because I'd promised her anything, I hadn't, but because she was using my reputation and my business relationships as currency while simultaneously telling me I didn't belong in her generation. She was building her future on the foundation I'd laid while publicly dismissing everything I'd accomplished. The irony was delicious. And it gave me the perfect opening for phase 1 of my plan. I spent the next week reaching out to my network. When you've been in construction as long as I have, you know people. Architects, developers, city planners, contractors, all the people a young communications major might want to impress. I made some calls, had some conversations, and planted some very specific seeds. The beauty of having a reputation is that people listen when you talk. And when Bob Mitchell suggests that someone might not be quite ready for the professional world, people take notice. I didn't lie about Emma. I didn't need to. I just shared some concerns about her maturity level, her attitude toward authority, and her tendency to speak before thinking things through. By the end of that week, Emma's name had been quietly removed from consideration for several internships she'd been counting on. Not because of anything she'd done wrong, exactly, but because people in my industry talk to each other, and word gets around quickly about potential problems. But that was just the appetizer. The main course required a much more personal touch. Emma had always been obsessed with social media. Her Instagram account had thousands of followers, and she'd been building what she called her personal brand around lifestyle and family content. She posted constantly about family dinners, holiday traditions, and the wisdom she'd gained from her multicultural, multi-generational family experience. The problem was that most of her content featured my house, my property, and stories about her incredible grandfather, who'd built an empire from nothing. She'd been monetizing our family history, literally earning money from sponsored posts that featured my life story, without ever asking permission or even acknowledging the source of her material. That's when I realized something that made my blood run cold. Emma didn't just disrespect me personally. She'd been using me as content for months, maybe years, while planning to cut me out of the family decision-making process. She wanted to have it both ways, benefit from my legacy while dismissing my relevance. I spent hours scrolling through her posts, documenting every photo of my house, every story about family traditions I'd started, every reference to lessons she'd learned from her grandfather. The picture that emerged was of a young woman who'd built her entire online persona around a relationship she was simultaneously trying to end. That's when I decided to introduce Emma to the concept of consequences. I started small. A few phone calls to mutual acquaintances, mentioning how disappointed I was that Emma seemed to be misrepresenting our relationship online. I didn't ask anyone to do anything specific. I just expressed my concern that she might be taking advantage of family connections for personal gain. Within a week, Emma's engagement numbers started dropping. Comments on her posts became more skeptical. People started asking pointed questions about whether she had permission to share family stories and use family property in her sponsored content. Her carefully curated image of the grateful, wise granddaughter began to crack under scrutiny. But I wasn't done. Not even close. The thing about young people is that they assume technology is their exclusive domain. They think that just because they grew up with smartphones and social media, older generations are automatically clueless about how the digital world works. Emma had forgotten that I'd been running a business website since 1995, that I'd been using email and digital communication to coordinate million-dollar projects for decades. She'd also forgotten that I still had connections everywhere, including at Northwestern. I'd been donating to the university's scholarship fund for 15 years. Not huge amounts, but enough to have name recognition in the development office. Enough that when I called to express concerns about a current student who seemed to be struggling academically while spending most of her time on social media ventures, people listened. I didn't ask them to take any action against Emma. I just shared my observations as a concerned family member who was worried about her priorities. I mentioned that she seemed more focused on building her online brand than on her studies, and that I was concerned about the example she was setting for younger family members. Higher education institutions take academic integrity very seriously, especially when it comes to students who might be profiting from their university affiliation without proper disclosure. When the administration started looking into Emma's social media activities, they discovered that she'd been promoting herself as a Northwestern student in sponsored posts without following the university's guidelines for student endorsements. The result was a formal review of her social media activities and a requirement that she either comply with university policies or face disciplinary action. Emma was forced to either stop monetizing her family content or risk her academic standing. She chose to comply, which meant taking down dozens of posts and losing thousands of dollars in potential sponsorship revenue. But more importantly, it meant watching her carefully constructed online empire start to crumble, piece by piece. And I was just getting started. The most satisfying part wasn't the financial impact, or even the damage to her reputation. It was watching Emma realize that the grandfather she'd dismissed as irrelevant still had more influence in the real world than she'd ever imagined. Every phone call I made, every conversation I had, every connection I leveraged was a reminder that respect isn't something you can simply decide to withdraw from someone who's spent decades earning it. But what Emma didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this was just the foundation. I'd spent my entire career building things that lasted, and this revenge was going to be my masterpiece. Every move I'd made so far was just preparation for what was coming next. Because if Emma wanted to play generational warfare, she was about to learn that some games are won not by youth and energy, but by experience and patience. And after 67 years on this earth, I had more of both than she could possibly imagine. The problem with families is that everyone thinks they know everyone else's business, but the truth is, we all have secrets. And when you've been the head of a family for as long as I have, you end up being the keeper of more secrets than anyone realizes. 3 weeks after the dinner disaster, I was sitting in my study, going through old files and documents, when I stumbled across something that made me stop cold. It was a manila folder I'd forgotten about, tucked behind some tax returns from 2019. The folder contained correspondence about Emma's college funding, specifically, about the academic scholarship she'd received that had covered nearly 60% of her tuition. Except it wasn't really a scholarship. It was money I'd donated to Northwestern specifically earmarked for Emma's education, routed through the university's general scholarship fund to make it look official. I'd set it up that way because I knew Emma was too proud to accept direct financial help from family, and I wanted her to feel like she'd earned her way into college. For 3 years, Emma had been bragging to anyone who would listen about her academic merit scholarship, about how she'd earned her way into Northwestern through her own intelligence and hard work. She'd used that scholarship as proof of her independence, as evidence that she didn't need family support to succeed. And all the while, it was my money paying for more than half of her education. The irony was breathtaking. The same granddaughter who told me I didn't belong in her generation had been unknowingly living off my generosity for years. Every semester, every dorm room, every textbook, all subsidized by the grandfather she thought was irrelevant. But here's the thing that really got my blood boiling. I found emails between Emma and the financial aid office, emails where she explicitly stated that she had no family financial support and needed aid based on her own merit. She'd lied on her financial aid applications, claiming independence while secretly being supported by family money. That's fraud. Plain and simple. And fraud, even the well-intentioned kind, has consequences. I made copies of everything. The donation records, the correspondence with the university, the financial aid applications where Emma had claimed no family support. I put it all in a neat little folder and set it aside. Not because I was planning to use it immediately, but because I'd learned long ago that information is power, and power is best used strategically. If you're wondering whether I felt guilty about what I was discovering, let me be clear. I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. This is what happens when you bite the hand that feeds you. Sometimes you discover that hand has been feeding you all along. But the college funding was just the beginning. Once I started digging into Emma's life with the methodical thoroughness that had made me successful in business, I uncovered a whole web of lies and half-truths that she'd been spinning for years. Remember that personal brand she'd been building on social media? The one that portrayed her as this independent, self-made young woman who'd overcome obstacles through her own determination. Turns out, most of it was fantasy. The internship she'd bragged about at a Chicago marketing firm? She'd gotten it through her father's law firm connections. The exclusive events she attended and posted about. Most were family business functions that she attended as my guest. Even her apartment near campus, the one she claimed to afford through her social media income, was in a building owned by one of my old construction clients who was giving her a massive discount as a favor to me. Emma had built her entire identity around being independent and self-sufficient, but the deeper I dug, the more I realized that her life was almost entirely supported by the family connections she claimed to be moving beyond. And she had no idea I knew any of this. The beauty of my position was that I'd spent decades learning how to be patient. In construction, you don't rush the foundation. You prepare the ground carefully, you pour the concrete methodically, and you wait for it to cure properly before you build anything on top of it. Revenge, I was learning, followed the same principles. So I kept gathering information. I reached out to old friends, business associates, and family connections to quietly learn more about Emma's real situation. What I discovered was a young woman who was living far beyond her means, whose social media income was nowhere near what she claimed, and who was quietly accumulating debt while maintaining the appearance of success. She owed money on credit cards, had taken out additional student loans beyond what her scholarship covered, and was barely making minimum payments on everything. Her financial house of cards was already wobbling. It just needed the right push to come tumbling down. But the most interesting discovery came from an unexpected source. During one of my regular coffee meetings with Frank Kowalski, who'd been my accountant for 25 years, he mentioned something that made my ears perk up. Frank's daughter worked in the financial aid office at Northwestern, and she mentioned seeing Emma's name come up in some unusual contexts. It turns out that Emma had been trying to renegotiate her aid package for the upcoming semester, claiming that her family financial situation had changed dramatically. She was attempting to increase her aid by portraying herself as financially cut off from family support. Essentially, she was trying to double-dip, benefit from my secret donations while simultaneously claiming to need more aid because she had no family help. This wasn't just pride or independence anymore. This was calculated deception, and it was about to become very expensive for her. I realized in that moment that Emma hadn't just insulted me at dinner, she'd been manipulating the entire family for years. She'd been playing the role of the struggling student, while secretly benefiting from advantages she refused to acknowledge. She'd been building her personal brand on the foundation of family connections while simultaneously planning to distance herself from that same family. The girl who told me I didn't belong in her generation had been living as a fraud in her own generation. And now I had all the documentation I needed to prove it. But I still wasn't ready to make my move. Because the best revenge isn't just about exposing someone's lies. It's about making them face the consequences of their choices in a way that teaches them something they'll never forget. Emma wanted independence? She was about to get more independence than she'd ever bargained for. She wanted to succeed without family support? I was about to show her exactly what life looked like when that support was actually withdrawn. And the beautiful thing was, she was going to do most of the work herself. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is absolutely nothing. And sometimes, doing nothing requires more planning and precision than doing everything. For the next month, I perfected the art of strategic withdrawal. When David called to invite me to Tyler's birthday party, I politely declined, saying I had other commitments. When Rebecca texted about family dinner plans, I responded that I was trying to give the younger generation more space to make their own decisions. When Emma posted a throwback photo of us from her high school graduation with some caption about family legacy, I didn't like it, didn't comment, didn't acknowledge it at all. The silence was deafening, and it was exactly what I'd hoped for. You have to understand, for decades, I'd been the gravitational center of this family. I was the one who organized holiday gatherings, who remembered everyone's birthdays, who showed up when people needed help moving or fixing something or just needed someone to talk to. I was the emergency contact, the problem solver, the safety net that everyone took for granted. Until I wasn't. The first crack appeared when Tyler's birthday party had to be moved from my house, which had been the traditional venue for family celebrations, to David's much smaller townhouse. They'd always used my place because it had the space, the big backyard, the pool, and the kitchen that could handle feeding 20+ people. But since I wasn't attending, they had to make other arrangements. What they discovered was that hosting a large family gathering is expensive and complicated when you don't have access to someone else's house, someone else's backyard, and someone else's willingness to handle all the preparation and cleanup. The second crack appeared when Rebecca's dishwasher broke and flooded her kitchen. For 15 years, whenever anyone in the family had a home maintenance emergency, they called me. I always showed up with my tools and my experience, and I never charged them a dime. But when Rebecca called this time, I very politely explained that I was trying to respect Emma's wishes about stepping aside from family involvement, and suggested she call a professional plumber. The estimate she got? $1,200 for a job I could have done for the cost of a $40 part. The third crack was the big one, and it came from an unexpected direction. My son Michael, David's older brother, called me with panic in his voice. His teenage daughter Sarah had gotten into some trouble at school, nothing serious, just the kind of stupid teenage mistake that requires adult intervention and guidance. Normally, I would have been the first person he called, because I'd been dealing with teenage crises since before his own teenage crises. But when Michael called, I could hear the desperation in his voice. He'd already tried handling it himself, and he'd made it worse. His wife was hysterical. Sarah was refusing to talk to either of them, and the school was threatening serious consequences. He needed the kind of calm, experienced perspective that comes from having navigated these waters many times before. I listened to his entire story, offered him my sympathy, and then very gently explained that I was trying to follow Emma's advice about stepping aside from family decision-making. I suggested he figure it out himself, since the younger generation seemed to have all the answers. The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. Michael had finally realized what the rest of the family was apparently too proud to admit. They needed me more than I needed them. But I wasn't done teaching lessons. Not by a long shot. Emma's financial situation was getting more precarious by the week. Without my unknown support, and without the internship opportunities that had mysteriously dried up, she was struggling to maintain the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to. Her social media posts became more desperate, more focused on promoting products and services, more obviously commercial and less authentically personal. Her follower count started dropping as people grew tired of the constant sales pitches. Her engagement rates plummeted as her content became more about making money and less about sharing genuine experiences. The personal brand she'd worked so hard to build was collapsing under the weight of financial pressure. And then the universe handed me a gift that I couldn't have planned if I'd tried. Emma's roommate called me. Her name was Jessica Chin, and she was a sweet kid who'd always been respectful during the few times we'd met. She was calling because she was worried about Emma and didn't know where else to turn. Emma had been acting erratically, staying up all night working on social media content, skipping classes to attend networking events that weren't producing any real opportunities. But the real reason Jessica called was financial. Emma hadn't paid her share of rent in 2 months, and Jessica couldn't cover it alone anymore. She was facing eviction, and she was terrified of confronting Emma about the money because Emma had been claiming that her family was about to step in with financial support for a big new project. According to Jessica, Emma had been telling people that her grandfather was planning to fund some kind of social media venture for her, a family business expansion that would leverage both traditional construction expertise and modern digital marketing. She'd been using this fictional family investment to secure credit, to justify her spending, and to string along her roommate with promises of payment. The girl who told me I didn't belong in her generation had been using my reputation to commit fraud while I wasn't even speaking to her. That's when I knew it was time to accelerate the timeline. I asked Jessica not to mention our conversation to Emma, and I arranged to quietly pay the back rent directly to the landlord, not as a gift to Emma, but as a favor to Jessica, who was an innocent victim in Emma's web of lies. I also made it clear to the landlord that this was a one-time intervention and that any future issues should be handled according to standard lease procedures. Emma never knew I'd saved her from eviction. But she was about to learn that salvation and revenge could come from the same hand. Because while I was quietly solving problems she'd created, I was also documenting everything. Every lie she told, every promise she'd made using my name, every financial commitment she'd entered into based on family support that didn't exist. I was building a comprehensive record of just how dependent this independent young woman really was. And soon, very soon, I was going to present her with an itemized bill for everything she owed, not just in money, but in respect, honesty, and basic human decency. The foundation was set. The walls were framed. Now it was time to start working on the roof. November came early that year, bringing with it the kind of bitter cold that makes you appreciate whatever warmth you can find. But I wasn't feeling the cold anymore. I was too focused on the final preparations for what I'd started calling Operation Reality Check. The trigger came on a Tuesday morning when I received a call from Northwestern's financial aid office. They wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss irregularities in Emma's aid application and some questions about her family financial situation. Apparently, someone had raised concerns about potential misrepresentation, and they needed to conduct a formal review. That someone, of course, had been me. Not directly, but through the careful web of connections and conversations I'd been cultivating for weeks. When you've been donating to an institution for 15 years and you express concerns about a student's integrity, people take notice. I scheduled the meeting for the following Friday, and I spent the week preparing for what would be the most important presentation of my life. Not because I was trying to sell something or win a contract, but because I was about to teach my granddaughter the most expensive lesson she'd ever receive. The night before the meeting, I did something I hadn't done since Margaret's funeral. I called a family meeting. I sent a group text to David, Michael, and their wives, asking them to come to the house Saturday evening for dinner. I kept the message simple and warm, just like the old days. I even mentioned that I was planning to cook Margaret's famous pot roast, something I hadn't attempted since she'd passed. The responses came quickly. David and Rebecca said they'd be there, but they were bringing Emma because she was having some difficult conversations with the university and needed family support. Michael and Linda confirmed they'd attend, and Michael added that he hoped we could talk about the misunderstanding from the previous month. Perfect. Everyone would be there for the grand finale. Friday's meeting at Northwestern went exactly as I'd expected. I sat across from Dean Patricia Williams, a woman I'd met several times at university functions, and calmly presented my documentation of Emma's financial aid fraud. I had bank records showing my donations earmarked for her tuition, copies of her aid applications claiming no family support, and evidence of her using family connections for personal gain while denying those connections existed. Dean Williams listened with the kind of professional calm that comes from dealing with difficult situations for decades. When I finished, she thanked me for bringing the matter to their attention and assured me that the university would handle it appropriately. I drove home that afternoon knowing that Emma was about to face consequences she couldn't charm or manipulate her way out of. But the real confrontation was still 24 hours away. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that makes everything seem sharp and defined. I spent the afternoon preparing Margaret's pot roast, setting the table with her good china, and arranging everything exactly the way she would have done it. If this was going to be our last family dinner for a while, I wanted it to be memorable. They arrived together, all of them, looking like they were attending a funeral rather than a family gathering. Emma walked in last, and I could see immediately that she'd been crying. Her usual confident demeanor was gone, replaced by the kind of hollow-eyed exhaustion that comes from having your world pulled out from under you. We made small talk through the first course. David complimented the pot roast. Rebecca asked about my garden, Michael mentioned that he'd been thinking about Dad a lot lately, and wished he'd listened to my advice about some business decisions. Everyone was walking on eggshells, waiting for someone to address the elephant in the room. Finally, Emma broke. Right there between the main course and dessert, she started crying and told everyone about her meeting with the university administration. She explained that there had been some misunderstanding about her financial aid, that someone had made allegations about her family's support, and that she might lose her scholarship. She looked directly at me when she said it, and I could see in her eyes that she knew. Somehow, she'd figured out that her grandfather, the one who didn't belong in her generation, had been pulling strings behind the scenes. "I don't understand why this is happening," she said, her voice breaking. "I've worked so hard for everything I have. I've never asked anyone for handouts. I've been completely honest about my situation." That's when I stood up and walked to my study, returning with the manila folder I'd prepared. "Emma," I said, setting the folder on the table in front of her, "I think it's time we talked about honesty." I opened the folder and began laying out documents like I was presenting evidence in a courtroom. Bank records showing my donations to Northwestern. Correspondence with the financial aid office arranging for the money to be distributed as a merit scholarship. Copies of Emma's aid applications claiming no family financial support. The table went silent as everyone processed what they were seeing. Emma's face went white, then red, then white again. David and Michael exchanged glances that said they were starting to understand the scope of what had been happening behind the scenes. "For 3 years," I continued, my voice steady and calm, "you've been receiving money from me to pay for your education. Money that you've been claiming as a merit scholarship, while simultaneously filling out forms stating that you receive no family financial support. Money that has allowed you to live the independent lifestyle you've been bragging about on social media." Emma tried to speak, but I held up my hand. "I'm not finished. For the past 6 months, you've been telling people that your family is planning to invest in your social media business. You've been using my name and my reputation to secure credit and to string along people like your roommate. You've been building your entire online presence around family stories and family property while simultaneously arguing that I'm irrelevant to your generation." I reached into the folder and pulled out printouts of her social media posts, screenshots of her sponsored content featuring my house and my stories. "You want to know the truth about generational differences, Emma? Here it is. My generation built things to last. We understood that foundation matters, that reputation matters, that your word matters. We knew that you can't build something real on a foundation of lies." The room was so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Everyone was staring at the documents spread across Margaret's good china, processing the reality of what Emma had been doing. "Your generation," I continued, "seems to think that image is more important than substance, that perception is more important than reality, that you can succeed by packaging lies in attractive presentations. You've spent 3 years proving that theory wrong." Emma finally found her voice. "Grandpa, I didn't know. I thought the scholarship was real. I thought I'd earned it." "You did earn it," I said. "You earned it by being my granddaughter. But you've spent the last month telling me that family connections don't matter, that my generation is irrelevant, that you've succeeded entirely on your own merit. So I thought I'd give you the opportunity to prove it." I reached for the last document in the folder, a letter I'd written to Northwestern's financial aid office. "This is a formal request to discontinue my donations to your scholarship fund, effective immediately. I've also informed them that any future aid decisions should be based solely on your actual financial situation, without consideration of family assets or connections that you've claimed don't exist." The impact was immediate. Emma's hands started shaking, and I could see her doing the math in her head. Without the scholarship money, she'd be facing full tuition for her final year, close to $60,000 that she absolutely didn't have. "But Grandpa," she whispered, "I can't afford." "Of course you can't," I interrupted. "Because despite all your talk about independence and self-sufficiency, you've been living off family money this entire time. The only difference is that now you know it." David finally spoke up. "Dad, don't you think this is a little extreme? Emma made a mistake, but destroying her education. I'm not destroying anything, I said, looking directly at my son. I'm simply respecting her wishes. She told me I don't belong in her generation, that it's time for me to step aside. I'm stepping aside. All the way aside. I gathered up the documents and put them back in the folder. Emma, you have two choices. You can find a way to pay for your education using the same independence and self-sufficiency you've been bragging about. Or you can admit that family connections matter, that respect works both ways, and that there are consequences for treating people like they're disposable. I stood up from the table, looking around at the faces of my family, some shocked, some angry, some finally beginning to understand what I'd been dealing with. I love all of you, I said. But love doesn't mean accepting disrespect. And respect isn't something you can withdraw from someone and then expect to keep receiving from them. Emma was sobbing now, and part of me wanted to comfort her the way I had when she was little and had scraped her knee or lost a toy. But the part of me that had learned to be ruthless in business knew that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let someone face the full consequences of their choices. I'll be upstairs if anyone wants to have a real conversation about respect and family, I said. But I'm done pretending that being related to someone gives them the right to treat me like I'm worthless. As I walked toward the stairs, I could hear Emma's voice behind me, broken and desperate. Grandpa, please. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. I need that scholarship. I need your help. I paused at the bottom of the stairs and turned back to look at her. Emma, 3 weeks ago you told me I didn't belong in your generation. Tonight you're learning what it means to actually live in your generation without any support from mine. How's that working out for you? The crash came exactly 1 week later. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but I learned that week that it's actually best served with perfect timing. Because while Emma was scrambling to figure out how to pay for her final year of college, the rest of her carefully constructed life began unraveling like a cheap sweater. The call came from Jessica, Emma's roommate, on a Thursday morning that started gray and got darker by the hour. Emma had apparently had what Jessica called a complete breakdown the night before. She'd stayed up until 4 in the morning making frantic phone calls to relatives, friends, anyone who might be able to help her come up with $60,000 for tuition. But here's the thing about financial desperation. It makes you sloppy. And Emma, in her panic, had started making promises and commitments that she had no way of keeping. She told 3 different family friends that she was about to receive a large family inheritance that would allow her to repay loans immediately. She'd promised her credit card companies that a family business investment was imminent. She'd even told Jessica that her grandfather was planning to give her money for a new apartment deposit, despite the fact that we hadn't spoken since the dinner disaster. Every single promise was a lie, and every single lie was building toward a moment of reckoning that was coming faster than she realized. The beautiful thing about having built a business over 4 decades is that you develop an instinct for when things are about to collapse. I could feel Emma's situation reaching that critical point where desperation transforms into reckless decision-making. And reckless decision-making, in my experience, is when people reveal who they really are. I didn't have to wait long. Friday afternoon, Emma showed up at my front door. She'd driven straight from campus, still wearing the same clothes from the day before, looking like she hadn't slept in a week. When I opened the door, she immediately started talking, not apologizing, not acknowledging what she'd said at dinner, but explaining why I needed to fix her problems. She told me about the scholarship situation, about the financial pressure, about how unfair it was that her education was being threatened over a simple misunderstanding. She talked about her future, her dreams, her plans to make a difference in the world. She painted herself as a victim of bureaucratic confusion and bad timing. What she didn't do was take responsibility for anything she'd said or done. "Grandpa," she finally said, tears streaming down her face, "I know you can fix this. You have connections at the university, you have money, you have influence. You've always taken care of the family. I need you to take care of this." I let her finish. I let her exhaust herself with explanations and justifications and desperate appeals to family loyalty. And then I asked her one simple question. Emma, do you remember what you said to me at dinner 3 weeks ago? She looked confused, like she genuinely couldn't understand why I was bringing up ancient history when she had a crisis to solve. I said a lot of things that night, she replied. But this isn't about that. This is about my future. This is about you helping your granddaughter when she needs you most. That's when I realized that Emma wasn't just disrespectful, she was fundamentally incapable of connecting her actions to their consequences. In her mind, the cruel things she'd said to me were completely separate from the current crisis she was facing. She expected me to compartmentalize my feelings the same way she compartmentalized her behavior. Emma, I said, you told me I don't belong in your generation. You told me it was time for me to step aside. I'm doing exactly what you asked for. But I didn't mean, she started. You meant exactly what you said, I interrupted. You meant that my opinions don't matter, that my experience is irrelevant, that my role in this family should be diminished. And now you're experiencing what life looks like when you get exactly what you asked for. I could see the exact moment when she realized that her grandfather wasn't going to save her. Her face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, anger, panic, and finally, a kind of desperate calculation that told me she was already planning her next move. Fine, she said, her voice turning cold. If you want to be petty and vindictive over something I said when I was upset, that's your choice. But don't pretend this is about teaching me some kind of lesson. This is just you being cruel because your feelings got hurt. And there it was. Even facing the collapse of everything she'd built, Emma couldn't acknowledge that her words had been wrong. Instead, she was doubling down, making me the villain in her story, painting herself as the victim of an unreasonable old man's wounded pride. You're right, I said. This is about my feelings getting hurt. But it's also about something much more important than that. I walked to my desk and pulled out a manila envelope I'd been preparing for weeks. Inside was a complete financial breakdown of everything Emma had cost me over the years, not just the college funding, but the networking events she'd attended as my guest, the business connections she'd leveraged, the opportunities she'd been given because of her last name. The total came to just over $180,000 across 4 years. This, I said, handing her the envelope, is what independence actually costs. This is the real price of everything you've been claiming to achieve on your own merit. Emma opened the envelope with shaking hands and stared at the numbers. I watched her face as she processed the reality of her situation, not just the immediate crisis with tuition, but the broader truth about how much of her life had been subsidized by family money she'd refused to acknowledge. I want you to understand something, Emma, I continued. This isn't about revenge. This is about reality. You can't build a life on a foundation of lies and expect it to remain stable when someone starts asking questions. You can't benefit from family connections while simultaneously claiming those connections don't matter. She looked up from the papers, and for the first time since this whole mess started, I saw something in her eyes that looked like genuine understanding. What do you want from me? She asked quietly. I want you to make a choice, I said. You can continue down this path of independence and self-sufficiency, in which case you'll need to find a way to pay me back the money you've already received and fund the rest of your education yourself. Or you can acknowledge that family matters, that respect works both ways, and that your grandfather might actually belong in your generation after all. Emma stared at the documents for a long time, and I could practically see the wheels turning in her head. She was calculating costs and benefits, weighing pride against practicality, trying to find an angle that would let her win without admitting she'd been wrong. But some lessons can't be negotiated around. Some consequences can't be avoided through clever maneuvering or emotional manipulation. Sometimes you just have to face the truth about what you've done and who you've become. I need time to think, she finally said. Of course you do, I replied. Take all the time you need. But remember, every day you wait is another day closer to the tuition deadline. And I hear that registering late comes with some pretty significant penalty fees. After Emma left, I sat in my kitchen and felt something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just the quiet calm that comes from finally addressing a problem that's been eating at you from the inside. The dinner party was still 12 hours away, but I already knew how it was going to end. Emma would either come back with a genuine apology and a willingness to rebuild our relationship on terms of mutual respect, or she'd continue down her path of prideful independence and learn exactly how expensive that independence really was. Either way, the lesson would be learned. And either way, I'd finally reclaimed my place as someone who deserved respect in his own family. The only question left was whether Emma was smart enough to save herself, or proud enough to destroy everything she'd worked for rather than admit she'd been wrong. We were about to find out. Saturday evening brought more than just my family to dinner, it brought the reckoning I'd been building toward for 2 months. They arrived separately this time, not as the united front they'd presented at the previous gathering, and I could tell immediately that the family dynamics had shifted in ways none of them fully understood yet. David and Rebecca came first, and Rebecca was carrying a bottle of wine that cost more than most people spend on groceries in a week. It was the kind of peace offering that rich people give when they're trying to smooth over situations they don't really understand but sense might be expensive for them. Michael and Linda arrived 10 minutes later with their teenage daughter Sarah, the same Sarah who'd been in trouble at school when Michael had called me for help that I'd politely declined to provide. Sarah looked subdued, and I noticed she stayed close to her parents instead of immediately gravitating toward her phone like most teenagers do. Emma was the last to arrive, and she looked like she'd aged 5 years in the past week. The confident young woman who dismissed me at this same table 2 months ago was gone, replaced by someone who looked genuinely frightened about what was coming next. We sat down to dinner with the kind of forced pleasantry that families specialize in when everyone knows there's about to be a serious conversation but nobody wants to be the one to start it. I served Margaret's pot roast and listened to them make small talk about work and school and the weather, all the while watching Emma struggle to maintain her composure. The breaking point came during dessert when Michael finally addressed what everyone was thinking. "Dad," he said, "we need to talk about what's been happening with Emma's school situation. Rebecca mentioned that there might be some kind of misunderstanding with her financial aid." I set down my coffee cup and looked around the table at my family. "There's no misunderstanding," I said. "Emma applied for financial aid by claiming she had no family support, while simultaneously receiving substantial support from family. That's fraud, and it has consequences." David's lawyer instincts kicked in immediately. "Dad, are you saying you've been involved in Emma's financial aid issues? Because if there's been some kind of coordination—" "There's been no coordination," I interrupted. "I donated money to Northwestern's General Scholarship Fund, which they distributed according to their own criteria. Emma lied on her applications about her family financial situation. Those are 2 separate facts that created one very expensive problem." Emma had been silent through this exchange, but now she couldn't hold back anymore. "You did this on purpose," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "You set me up. You donated that money knowing I'd apply for aid, knowing it would create problems later." "I donated that money," I replied calmly, "because I wanted to support your education without damaging your pride. I routed it through the university because I knew you were too stubborn to accept direct help from family. I did it out of love and respect for your independence." I paused, letting that sink in before delivering the killing blow. "The fraud happened when you decided to claim you had no family support, while secretly benefiting from family money. That was your choice, Emma. Your decision to lie rather than acknowledge where your opportunities were really coming from." The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet of our previous confrontation. This was the silence of people beginning to understand that this situation was much more complicated and much more serious than they'd realized. Rebecca, always the social coordinator, tried to find middle ground. "Can't we figure out some way to work this out? Emma's learned her lesson, haven't you, Emma? Maybe we can all just move forward and—" "Move forward to what?" I asked. "To the next time one of you decides I'm inconvenient? To the next family dinner where someone explains why my opinions don't matter anymore?" I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the backyard where I taught these kids to play baseball, where we'd had countless barbecues and birthday parties, where Margaret had planted the garden that still bloomed every spring. For 40 years, I said without turning around, I've been the safety net for this family. When anyone needed money, I provided it. When anyone needed connections, I made the calls. When anyone needed help, I showed up. And I did it all without keeping score, without asking for recognition, without expecting anything in return except basic respect. I turned back to face them. But respect isn't something you can take for granted forever. And it's not something you can withdraw and then expect to restore when it becomes convenient. That's when Sarah, Michael's daughter, spoke up. Grandpa, I don't understand. What exactly do you want Emma to do? Leave it to a 16-year-old to ask the question everyone else was dancing around. I want Emma to understand that choices have consequences, I said. I want her to learn that you can't build a life on lies and expect it to remain stable when the truth comes out. And I want this family to understand that treating someone with disrespect doesn't become acceptable just because they're older. Emma finally broke down completely. Not the calculated tears she'd used when she came to my door asking for help, but the raw, ugly crying of someone whose world is collapsing and who finally understands that they caused the collapse themselves. I'm sorry, she sobbed. I'm so sorry, Grandpa. I was wrong. I was stupid and wrong, and I don't know how to fix this. For a moment, just a moment, I felt my resolve waver. This was my granddaughter, the little girl who used to fall asleep in my lap while I read her stories, who used to follow me around the construction sites wearing a tiny hard hat and asking a million questions about everything. But then I remembered her voice that night at dinner, the casual cruelty of suggesting I step aside, the way everyone else had just sat there and let it happen. Some wounds run too deep to heal with simple apologies. Sorry doesn't pay tuition, Emma, I said. Sorry doesn't undo months of lying on official documents. Sorry doesn't rebuild trust that's been systematically destroyed. David slammed his hand on the table. Damn it, Dad, she's 21 years old. She made a mistake. Are you really going to destroy her future over something she said when she was upset? I'm not destroying anything, I replied. I'm simply no longer participating in the fiction that Emma is independent and self-sufficient. If she wants to live without family support, she's free to do that. If she wants family support, she needs to understand what that actually means. The room erupted then. David and Michael both started talking at once. Rebecca was trying to mediate, Linda was comforting Emma, and Sarah was asking questions that nobody wanted to answer. It was chaos, but it was honest chaos. For the first time in months, everyone was saying what they really thought instead of tiptoeing around uncomfortable truths. And in the middle of all that noise and anger and desperation, I felt something unexpected, relief. Because finally, we were having the conversation that should have happened months ago. Finally, the family was being forced to confront the reality of what respect means, what support costs, and what happens when you take both for granted. The dinner ended with Emma leaving in tears, David and Michael arguing about whether I was being reasonable or vindictive, and the rest of the family unsure about where they stood in this new dynamic. Nobody had apologized to me. Nobody had acknowledged that Emma's original comments were wrong. But everybody finally understood that there were consequences for treating family members like they were disposable. As I cleaned up the dishes and put away Margaret's good china, I realized that I'd accomplished something important. I'd stopped being taken for granted. Whether that led to reconciliation or permanent estrangement remained to be seen, but at least it would be based on honest acknowledgement of what everyone was actually bringing to the relationship. Emma had one more week to figure out her tuition situation. One more week to decide whether her pride was worth $60,000 and the collapse of her academic career. One more week to learn whether my generation had anything valuable to offer hers after all. The phone call came at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning, jolting me from the first decent sleep I'd had in weeks. It was Dean Williams from Northwestern, and her voice carried the kind of professional concern that immediately told me something significant had happened. Mr. Mitchell, she said, I'm calling about your granddaughter Emma. I'm afraid we need to discuss some developments in her situation. My first thought was that Emma had found some way to manipulate the system, to charm her way out of the consequences she was facing. But as Dean Williams continued talking, I realized the situation was actually much worse than I'd anticipated. Emma had apparently spent the weekend making increasingly desperate attempts to resolve her financial crisis. She'd submitted 3 different appeals to the financial aid office, each one containing conflicting information about her family's situation. She tried to withdraw her previous statements about having no family support, then tried to claim that her original applications had been filled out incorrectly due to emotional distress. But the real problem was what she'd done Monday morning. Faced with a tuition deadline she couldn't meet and appeals that weren't going anywhere, Emma had apparently decided to take matters into her own hands. She'd accessed her father's computer. David had always been careless about passwords, and had tried to submit what looked like official documentation showing a family business loan that would cover her educational expenses. The documentation was fake. Clumsy, obvious fake, the kind of amateur forgery that gets spotted immediately by anyone who handles financial paperwork professionally. Emma had apparently thought she could create some kind of promissory note from Mitchell & Sons Construction guaranteeing payment of her tuition, forge my signature, and submit it as legitimate financial documentation. The irony was devastating. The granddaughter who'd told me I didn't belong in her generation had tried to commit fraud using my business name and my signature. She'd gone from dismissing my relevance to literally stealing my identity in the span of 2 months. Mr. Mitchell, Dean Williams continued, the university is required to report suspected financial aid fraud to federal authorities. However, given your long-standing relationship with the institution and the unusual circumstances involved, we wanted to speak with you before taking any formal action. I thanked her for the call and hung up, my mind racing through the implications of what Emma had done. This wasn't just about tuition anymore. This wasn't just about family respect or pride or teaching lessons about consequences. Emma had crossed a line that could destroy her life permanently. Federal financial aid fraud carries serious penalties. Prison time. A criminal record that would follow her forever. The end of any realistic career prospects in communications or social media or any field that requires background checks. For the first time since this whole mess started, I felt genuinely scared. Not for myself, but for Emma. Because in her desperation to avoid the consequences of her choices, she'd made a choice that carried consequences far worse than anything I'd planned. I spent the morning pacing through my house, trying to figure out how to handle a situation that had spiraled completely out of control. Part of me wanted to let Emma face the full weight of what she'd done. After all, she was an adult who'd made adult choices and needed to accept adult consequences. But part of me was still her grandfather. The man who taught her to ride a bike and helped her with algebra homework and promised her mother I'd always be there when she needed me. The call I'd been dreading came that afternoon. David, sounding more shaken than I'd heard him since Margaret's diagnosis, told me that Emma had confessed everything to him. The fake documentation, the forged signature, the increasingly desperate lies she'd been telling to various institutions and individuals. Dad, he said, she could go to prison for this. My daughter could go to federal prison because I was too cowardly to defend you at a family dinner. That's when I heard something in my son's voice that I hadn't heard since he was a little boy. He was asking his father to fix a problem that seemed too big to solve. David, I said, bring Emma to the house tonight. All of you. We're going to figure this out together. Dad, I don't think she can face you right now. She's pretty broken up about everything. She doesn't have a choice anymore, I replied. None of us do. This has gone beyond family drama. This is about keeping your daughter out of federal prison. That evening, they came to my house not as the confident family that had dismissed my relevance, but as desperate people who'd finally realized that some problems require the kind of experience and connections that only come with age. Emma could barely look at me when she walked through the front door. She'd lost weight, her hair was unwashed, and she had the hollow-eyed look of someone who'd been staring at the ceiling for days, contemplating the complete destruction of everything she'd worked for. But what struck me most was how young she looked. Stripped of her confident attitude and her social media persona, She looked like what she actually was, a scared kid who'd made some very adult mistakes and was finally realizing that the real world doesn't offer do-overs. We sat in my living room, the same room where she'd played with dolls and built blanket forts and listened to my stories about the old days, and I looked at my family, really looked at them, for the first time in months. "Here's what's going to happen," I said. "I'm going to make some phone calls, have some conversations, and see if I can convince Northwestern to handle this internally as an academic matter rather than reporting it to federal authorities. But that's going to require Emma to accept full responsibility for what she's done, withdraw from school immediately, and agree to some very specific conditions about her future behavior." Emma's head snapped up. "Withdraw from school? Emma," I said gently, "you committed fraud. The best-case scenario is that you avoid criminal charges. Your academic career is over either way." The silence that followed was the sound of dreams dying. But sometimes dreams need to die before better ones can take their place. The conversation that followed lasted until nearly 2 a.m, and it was the most honest discussion our family had ever had. Emma told us about the pressure she'd been feeling to live up to an image she'd created online, about the debt she'd been hiding, about the fear that admitting family support would somehow diminish her achievements. David and Michael talked about their own struggles with feeling caught between generations, wanting to honor their father while also establishing their independence. Rebecca and Linda admitted that they'd sometimes felt intimidated by my strong opinions and had encouraged their husbands to avoid conflicts rather than address them directly. And I talked about something I'd never shared with any of them: how lonely I'd been since Margaret died, how much I'd needed to feel useful and relevant to my family, how devastating it had been to hear that my presence in their lives was unwelcome. By the time the sun came up Sunday morning, we'd dismantled years of accumulated resentments, unspoken expectations, and mutual misunderstandings. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't comfortable, but it was real in a way that our family conversations had never been before. The next few weeks were busy ones. I made those phone calls to Northwestern, leveraging relationships I'd built over 15 years of donations and involvement. Emma withdrew from school officially, avoiding criminal charges but accepting academic consequences that would follow her for years. But more importantly, Emma and I started having regular conversations. Real conversations, not the performative interactions we'd been having for years where I played the indulgent grandfather, and she played the grateful granddaughter. I learned about the pressure she'd been feeling to succeed independently, about her fear that accepting family help would make her achievements meaningless. She learned about the satisfaction that comes from helping family succeed, about how my support had never been about control but about love. We talked about the difference between independence and isolation, between strength and stubbornness, between pride and integrity. We talked about what it means to be part of a family that spans generations, each with different perspectives but all connected by bonds that go deeper than temporary disagreements. Emma started working for my construction company that spring. Not in some made-up position designed to help her save face, but in a real job where she had to learn about permits and schedules and the thousand small details that go into building something that lasts. She was terrible at it initially, but she was also determined to prove that she could learn skills outside her comfort zone. The most surprising development was how much she taught me in return. Emma brought fresh perspectives on project management, helped modernize our communication systems, and introduced digital tools that made our operations more efficient. She also helped me understand social media in ways that actually improved our business marketing. But the real education happened in our daily conversations during lunch breaks and drive times. Emma learned about the pride that comes from building something with your hands, from solving problems through experience and persistence rather than Google searches and YouTube tutorials. I learned about the challenges facing her generation, about economic pressures and social expectations that were genuinely different from what my generation had faced. We both learned that respect isn't something you demand or withdraw, it's something you earn through consistent behavior over time. The family dinners resumed that summer, but they were different now. More honest, less performative. We talked about real issues instead of avoiding them. We disagreed about things without assuming disagreement meant disrespect. We built the kind of relationships that can survive conflict because they're based on genuine understanding rather than polite avoidance. Emma never went back to Northwestern. Instead, she finished her degree online while working full-time, paying her own way without hidden family support. It took her an extra year and cost her some of the social experiences she'd been looking forward to, but she graduated with something more valuable than a traditional college experience. She graduated with genuine pride in what she'd accomplished. The social media empire she'd been building collapsed completely, but she rebuilt it from scratch with authentic content about learning skilled trades, about bridging generational gaps, about the value of family relationships even when they're complicated. Her new following was smaller but more engaged, and her content was more honest and ultimately more valuable. More importantly, she learned to separate her identity from her image, to value substance over perception, to understand that real independence comes from having skills and relationships you can rely on, not from rejecting support from people who love you. The others learned lessons too. David and Michael started involving me in family decisions again, but they also started making more decisions themselves instead of defaulting to whatever Dad thought was best. We found a balance between experience and innovation, between tradition and change. But the biggest lesson was mine. I learned that being needed and being respected are two different things, and that demanding respect never works as well as earning it does. I learned that my relevance to my family wasn't about maintaining control or proving my importance, but about offering wisdom when it was wanted and support when it was needed. I also learned that revenge, when it's done right, isn't about destruction, it's about reconstruction. It's about breaking down the lies and pretenses that prevent authentic relationships and rebuilding those relationships on foundations that can actually support the weight of real love and genuine respect. Emma and I talk every day now. Not because we have to, but because we genuinely enjoy each other's company. She asks for my advice on things, and I ask for hers. We're building something together. A relationship that belongs to both our generations because it acknowledges the value that each generation brings to the other. Last month, Emma did something that surprised everyone. She asked me to walk her down the aisle at her wedding. Not because tradition demanded it, but because she wanted the man who taught her the most important lessons of her life to be the one who officially handed her over to her new family. As I write this, I'm sitting in my study looking at the photo from that wedding day. Emma's wearing Margaret's wedding dress, which she asked to borrow because she said she wanted to carry something beautiful from our family's past into her family's future. In the photo, we're both smiling, not the posed smiles you put on for cameras, but the genuine expressions of people who understand and respect each other. If you've stayed with me through this whole story, I hope you've learned something about the importance of treating family with respect, about the consequences of taking people for granted, and about the possibility of rebuilding relationships even after they've been badly damaged. Hit that subscribe button if this story resonated with you, and tell me in the comments about a time when you had to stand up for yourself with family. Because sometimes the people who love us most are also the people who hurt us deepest, and sometimes the only way to save a relationship is to be willing to lose it first. Family isn't just about blood or tradition or obligation. It's about choosing, every single day, to treat the people you love with the respect they deserve. And respect, real respect, has to go both ways, from the young to the old and from the old to the young. Emma learned that lesson the hard way. But she learned it. And now we have something better than what we had before. We have a relationship built on truth instead of convenience, on mutual respect instead of assumed obligation, on love that's been tested and proven strong enough to survive even the worst mistakes. That's worth more than all the smooth family dinners in the world.